Let's assume that you are not feeling well and you go to the doctor. And the doctor asks you a series of questions. The doctor asks you, do you think that it's cancer? And you say, well, no, I don't think it's cancer. And the doctor asks you, do you think it's a problem with your heart? And you say, well, no, I don't think it's a problem with my heart. And the doctor says, well, good. Why don't you take a couple of aspirin and everything should be fine? You'd probably wonder what kind of a doctor that is, right? Because you would expect the doctor to run some tests, to do some x-rays, to confirm it's not cancer, to confirm that it's not your heart. That's what a doctor is supposed to do. Or let's say that you're having problems with your car and you go to a mechanic, and the mechanic asks you, what do you think is wrong with your car? And you say, well, I'm afraid it might be the engine. The engine might be shot. And the mechanic says, okay, we'll put in a new engine, but that's going to cost you like $3,000. Again, you would probably think that's not much of a mechanic because you would expect the mechanic to pop open the hood, take a look around, confirm whether or not it's the engine or something else that's wrong with your car. So the idea here is that sometimes asking people questions is not going to get at what it is we're trying to find out. So simply asking people questions is not always the best research method. Surveys are a very popular research method, and oftentimes they are the best choice of research method, but other times we need to kind of pop open the hood and study the communication content itself and run some tests in order to answer our research questions or hypotheses. Let's assume for a minute that you were doing public relations and marketing for the university, for SHIP. And your goal is to try to get as much positive buzz as possible about the university in the local news media, to get the local media to publish or broadcast positive stories about SHIP. And you wanted to find out whether or not you were being successful in that mission. Now, how would you find out the answer to that? Well, doing a survey isn't going to give you the answer, right? You would have to actually sit down and look at the news stories that have been published or broadcast recently about Shippensburg University, study each one and ask yourself, does this story paint SHIP in a positive light or a negative light, or maybe somewhere in between? You would have to actually study the communication content, in this case, news stories themselves. So that is what content analysis is all about. It's about those situations where, in order to really answer your research question or test your hypothesis, you need to study the actual communication content, the messages themselves, as opposed to simply asking people a set of questions. So content analysis can be defined as a method of studying and analyzing communication in a systematic, objective, and quantitative manner for the purpose of measuring variables. So there are some important keywords in that definition. First of all, let's understand that content analysis does not look at a sample of people, because you're not interviewing or surveying or observing people. What you are doing is you are collecting a sample of content, a sample of communication texts. And then you are analyzing those communication texts in a way that is systematic, objective, and quantitative. Now, those three words are important because sometimes people get the wrong idea about content analysis. They say, oh yeah, I know what content analysis is. You know, like, for example, I took an undergraduate course where we watched movies and then we talked about the deeper meanings of those movies or how those movies spoke to us. What were some of those deeper themes that were at play in the movie? Okay, that's not really content analysis because that's a little more subjective, a little more interpretive, a little more opinionated, a little more touchy-feely than content analysis, which strives to be basically a scientific way of studying communication content. Systematic, objective, quantitative. Now, you may be wondering, is there a qualitative version of content analysis? There is, and that is sometimes referred to as textual analysis. But for right now, let's keep our focus on content analysis, and let's understand that it is considered to be a quantitative research method. So in content analysis, you are examining texts or social artifacts, the products of human communication. and you need to actually be able to access those texts or social artifacts. Now, we use those terms very broadly. So what are the texts or the social artifacts? Well, it depends on your research topic and your research questions or hypotheses. So in some cases, those texts might be news stories. In other cases, they might be press releases, or they might be song lyrics. They don't even have to necessarily be words. Texts in this sense can also include things like photos or YouTube videos. So texts is very broad here. Any sort of tangible form that human communication takes can be considered a text or a social artifact. And then content analysis takes all of those texts and it involves coding them. And coding them is the process of placing those texts or that content into a set of categories. Content analysis also draws a distinction between manifest and latent content. So let's talk about that distinction. Manifest content refers to the literal or the surface meaning of texts, whereas latent content is all about sort of reading between the lines, the deeper meanings or the hidden meanings. Manifest is about surface or literal meaning. Latent is about deeper or hidden meaning. Let's look at some examples of this. If I showed you this image and I asked you, what is this? We would all agree that it's an American flag. We would have 100% agreement about that. But if I asked you, what does this image mean, or what does this image represent? There could be a range of answers. Some people might say patriotism. Some people might say loyalty. Some folks might say the American dream or prosperity. Critics of the United States, and certainly there are critics of the US in other parts of the world, might say that this means imperialism or aggression or violence. There could be a range of meanings. So the manifest or literal meaning would be American flag, but the latent meaning could be a range of things. Similar story with this image. If I asked you, what is this? We would all agree it's a skull and crossbones. That would be the manifest content or the manifest meaning. But if I asked you, what does this image mean or what does it represent? Some of you might say death. Some of you might say evil. Some of you might say poison or danger or even pirates. Those would be examples of latent meaning or latent content. So which are we more concerned with in content analysis? Manifest content or latent content? Now, you might assume latent content. You might say, well, we're trying to get at those deeper or hidden meanings. But remember what we said about the definition of content analysis, right? It has to be objective and it has to be systematic. It's basically a scientific research method. So if we get too far on the path towards latent content, we're going to lose that objective systematic quality. And suddenly it becomes too loosey-goosey, too interpretive, too opinionated. So the standard or the goal in a content analysis is to achieve a high level of what we call intercoder reliability, which means that if two or more people coded, in other words, categorized the content, each of them should code it or categorize it in the same way. So, we could all agree we could reach probably 100% intercoder reliability in saying that the one image was an American flag. But if we were trying to code it as patriotism versus loyalty versus American dream versus imperialism, we might achieve a very low level of intercoder reliability. So I'm not saying that content analysis has to be only about manifest content. But what I am saying is that if you get too far on the spectrum towards latent content, you may reach a point where it's very difficult to achieve high intercoder reliability, and that is going to threaten or, undermine your research. So whatever it is you're coding for, it has to be something where you can reach that high level of agreement or intercoder reliability. So how do you actually do a content analysis? Well, in the next video, I am going to walk you through the series of steps that are involved in using this research method.